Hey, g'day, it's Prezzo and thanks for stopping by. Now, this is part two of restoring a pair of Japanese vintage tinplate cars. Now, these were really popular back in the 1960s and they are still quite collectible. Now, the two that I'm doing today were given to me as gifts when I was a child. Now, they sat around a box for many, many years, and when I took a look at them, they were looking a bit sad. They were quite badly dented and creased. There was a lot of corrosion on them. I thought it was about time to try to renovate them and restore them back to their, or something like their original condition. Now in the last video I dismantled all of the cars. I dealt with the rust and the corrosion that was on them, or I tried to remove a lot of the dents and the creases that were in the sheet metal, and I powder coated all of the sheet metal parts apart from the interiors of the cars. Now in today's video I want to take care of all of the chrome plating on the bright parts that go on these cars. So there's things like hubcaps and trims and tail lights and so on. So we'll try to get all of that done, but there's also some work that needs to be done on this police car. It needs to have some black panels added to it. So we'll have a look at that first, but then we'll move on with the electroplating. The original colour scheme for this car was black and white, being a police car, and a lot of the areas that are currently white need to be black. Now my initial thought was to use this heat resistant tape, mask off the white areas and then powder coat everything in black, but I didn't think it through. This tape would go over the white areas and they would soften when it goes back in the oven, so this tape could potentially leave marks in the white powder coat. So what I've decided to do is to paint this. Now I bought this fancy schmancy black 2-pack paint. It's a 2-pack linear polyurethane, 2 parts obviously, and the special thinners. And just for reference, that's $95 worth of paint to paint about 4 square inches of car. But I can use that on other projects. So I've got a couple of different types of masking tape here. So I'm going to do all of the masking on this, but there's one area on the bonnet here which has got a sort of a curve, and I've cut that curved piece of tape out on my COT laser cutter. So I just stuck it to this piece of sheet metal, lined it up, and then ran the vector cut around that tape there, and that gives me a nice accurate shape to put on the bonnet of the car. Now I've already got a piece of tape here with the center line and a correct distance back from the front of the car. So I'll get this one on. This is fairly critical that this is in the right place, and then everything else will get masked off. So let's try it. So I cut a little notch in this top edge here, and that aligns with this piece of tape. That bit of tape can come off now. We'll go ahead and we'll get all of the rest of the masking on, and then yeah, we'll spray it. Okay, still a bit of trimming to do around the front here, but I'll do the rest of this off camera and I'll show you when we're finished. Okay, that took at least an hour to get all that tape on there, and I had to go around the edges of the door here to make sure that the tape is burnished down over these little ridges in the body panels, because we don't want any paint bleeding underneath, but you can never tell. But I'll get the paint mixed up now and we'll try spraying that on. The paint that I'm using today is made by Nor Glass, and it's called Northane, and it's a 2-pack linear polyurethane. And the good thing about this is that it sets chemically. You're not relying on a thinner evaporating out of the paint. And it's a 2-to-1 mix, so I use this little measuring cup, and the minimum quantity I can do on this is 50 ml. And we'll put up to 33% thinner, and this is the proprietary thinner that goes with that paint. I'll use this little top feed, gravity's feed gun, and once I get started I've got to wear breathing apparatus because this stuff has got some nasty chemicals in it, and I'll do it outdoors. So once I get started I won't be able to talk about it. I'll just take it outside and we'll do it. Okay, it's the next morning and this paint's cured now, but what was left over from yesterday is still liquid, but this will eventually harden and form a solid lump as it polymerizes. But I'm dead keen to see how this turned out, so let's see if we can do the big reveal. Okay, so far so good. Okay, this didn't turn out quite as crisp and clean as I would like it. There's a little tiny smudge of paint's got underneath the tape there. That little black line there will come off, that'll polish off. All of this area here is covered up by a sheet metal part that fits inside that area, so I'm not worried about the overspray on the ends. But the door came out really good. They're okay. So overall, pretty happy. But what we need to do now is get all of the electroplating done on all of the trim parts for these two cars, and then we'll look at assembly. But yeah, pretty good. So these are the parts that have been soaking in the evaporust, and these need to be washed thoroughly and inspected, and then we'll try getting rid of any surface oxide on those parts or any of the existing chrome that might be loose or flaky. And basically it's just a lot of very tedious cleaning up and polishing and inspection, and there's no easy way to do it. Some of these parts are very, very small, which is going to be a real challenge. Just trying to hold them and wire them together so that they can be electroplated. A lot of these parts just don't have any convenient holes where you can put a wire in them. And these are the door handles off one of the cars. They're tiny. So I'm going to go next door now. We're going to get all these washed and remove the evaporust from them. I'm just going to scrub these individually with a toothbrush. So this one here has been soda blasted, and you can see it's sort of a coppery tinge to that. So the chrome on top is sort of gone, and what's underneath there is a copper layer. But we're going to put more copper over the top of that. So I'll do all of these, and then we'll come back and we'll look at a few that have been polished, and we'll look at the hubcaps and how I'm going to polish those, and then we'll try and get the copper on. Now, one thing I didn't mention was that once you've done this, if you leave these parts lying around, they'll start to corrode very, very quickly. So once you get started, you've got to keep moving on it and not try and let the parts sit there for any length of time. If you sort of keep them underwater, they're usually okay, but certainly just leaving it like that, sitting out on the bench, it'll start to go rusty almost straight away. To clean up these hubcaps, I've just turned a piece of wood in the metal lathe here, and the hubcaps is sort of a press fit over that, and we're just going to use red Scotch-Brite to clean off the last of the oxide that's on the surface there. Now there's a lot of underlying corrosion and pitting and so on. Can't really get that out, especially with this profile, which is quite intricate the way it's been pressed. But we'll do the best we can. So although that looks shiny now, there are little pits on the surface there. We can fill some of those with the copper, but at the end of the day it's still going to look a bit speckly. I'll get the rest of these done now, and these can go into the copper later on. For parts like these, I've been polishing these on this 800 grit abrasive wheel, and you've got to be a little bit careful here. These little tabs stick out and they can easily get caught in the wheel. Hard edges and sharp edges can get caught, and you've really got to keep your wits about you while you're doing this. And of course I can't get into this area in here, it's just too detailed. But I'll do the best I can on the big flat areas and see if I can get it better than that. That's about as good as I can get that. It's too hard to get into this detailed area. Later on, after the copper's gone on, we can get in there with sort of a firm brush and some paste polish and try to get the copper a little bit brighter in that area. And these big parts aren't too bad, it's the little tiny ones are going to be a real problem to hold. With these parts here, it's not easy. If you're using a solid nylon mop like this one here, they're a little bit more forgiving. With a cloth mop, like a loose cloth mop, any one of these little sharp edges can get caught. You can rip it out of your hand, it can bend it, you can throw it on the floor. And the worst situation is if you're doing something that's fairly big and thin, it can wrap around the cloth mop, and that happened to me once. I was polishing the bezel of an old clock. It got caught in the cloth mop right at the last minute, just as I was about to finish, and it tore all the skin off the back of my hand, and it was quite a nasty experience. But with this, I'm trying to stay away from any sharp edges or any little tabs there so nothing can get caught. But even so, it's risky, and if you think that it's too risky, you should go back to using something like wet and dry or an emery stick or something like that. But I'll do the rest of these off camera now, and then we'll move on. Some of the little tiny parts are going to require some special fixturing. With these little tiny parts, but the best I can do here is to grip that in a vice grip just by one of the tabs on the back. And I'm going to use a Dremel with a wire brush just to get the corrosion out of the center of that. I can't polish it, or at least not easily. I'll do it on a grey Scotch-Brite, but it's not going to come up with a mirror finish until we get the copper on anyway. Yeah, I think that's as good as I'm going to get that. This little push button here is in the center grill of the blue Fairlane, and when you press that in, it opens the hood or the bonnet, and I just press that onto a stick so I've got something to hold on to, and I did that on the buff with that 800 grit wheel. And I've just also been rubbing on it's like a red Scotch-Brite to try and get a bit more of a shine on it. But that's about as good as I'm going to get with that one too. With these tiny little parts here, they need to be wired onto the power supply when we do the electroplating, and there's no holes in them. There's no way of actually getting a wire attached to some of these parts So I'm going to have to soft solder a very small copper wire to each one, so we can do the electroplating, and then that wire can be used to sort of dip them and agitate them and so on. Then later on we can just cut it off. What I'm going to try to do here is to melt this solder on the end of this piece of copper wire here into the center of that part. This is the back of the part, and because it's still a bit corroded on the back there, I'm just going to use a tiny amount of acid flux there. And a bit of heat. See how we go. So that's all it needs. So we'll get the rest of those parts done the same way. I'm just about to start putting some of the parts into this copper plating solution, so I'll run you through the kit that I've got on the bench here, and you can decide whether it's going to work for you at home. Now, I buy all of the materials that are used for this process from a company here in Australia called Jane Kits. So that's them there. Now, I find that their prices are reasonable. They've got a really good supply of different chemicals for all sorts of metal finishing processes. But the one that we're using today is called UltraStrike. Now, this is a non-cyanide alkaline copper solution. Now, in the first video I did on this series, I said that this was an acid copper bath. It's actually not. I just read the book, and it's an alkaline solution. Now, in the electrofinishing trade, or the electroplating trade, if they want to put copper on steel, they would use a cyanide copper solution. But that's too toxic for home use, but this alkaline solution works really well. So I got 4 litres of the solution in this 5 litre bucket. I have got a heater in this, and it's currently running at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, you can run it at room temperature. If it's sort of a hot or a warm day, you probably don't need to heat it. But I've got the heater anyway, so I put it in there, and I've let that warm up. And it's just sort of lukewarm. Now, I've got 2 flat copper anodes sitting in the side of the bath, and they're connected together with a bridge wire. And there is a copper bar on top here for hanging the parts. Now, my power supply is here, and this is the same one that I use for anodizing and other electroplating in the home shop. It's running at 2 volts and about half an amp. Now, the voltage, generally is between 2 and 5 volts, and for the amperage, you want to start off fairly low and then crank it up a bit as you put the parts in. You can calculate what the amperage needs to be, but for odd-shaped parts, it's very, very difficult to work out the surface area. So I'll generally start off at about between 0.2 and half an amp, and then I'll crank it up a bit, and what you're looking for is sort of fine bubbles coming off the work as it's plating. Now, I've got the parts sitting in the sink next door, and they've been washed and cleaned, and they've got their wires attached. Now, they're going to go into a hydrochloric or a muriatic acid bath, and that will strip off any of the remaining corrosion that's on there. They'll get rinsed, and then they will go into this solution here. Now, this is called Metex M Activator. Now, you can buy this from Jane Kits. It's quite cheap. It's about $5 for a bag of crystals, and you mix it up with water. And what this does is it strips off anything that's on the surface, like oxide or maybe corrosion, and then it activates the surface so that when it goes into this solution, it more readily takes on the copper coating. Now, you don't necessarily need to use this. If your parts are really clean already, you may get away without it, but it's fairly cheap, and I have it anyway. I use it for parkerizing, so I'll put that there, and we'll run the parts through that before they go in here. So all of these parts are sitting in water now, and they've got their wires attached to them. So what we'll do is we'll get one of these out, and we're just going to put that into this little container here. Now, this has just got hydrochloric acid in it. So I get that from the hardware store, and obviously you need to take precautions with this stuff. Now, if I leave that in there long enough, it will take all of the chrome, any of the existing chrome, off that part, but it will also etch the surface quite deeply, and I'm going to lose any sort of shine that I've already put on it. So I've just got to be a bit careful, not leave that in there for too long. Now, what I've noticed is that some of these parts still have chrome on them. I just can't get it off easily, and where the chrome is visible, the copper plate doesn't like to deposit over that existing chrome. But what I'm trying to do here is to get the copper to go onto the bare steel. So when we do the nickel cobalt coating, it will give us a uniform finish on both metals, on the chrome and the bare steel or the copper that's over the top of that. If you're going to do this, you need to rinse it really thoroughly. Don't just sort of spray it with water or just give it a quick swish under the tap. Make sure you get into any sort of areas where there might be acid trapped, because you don't want to contaminate the next step in the process. Alright, we're going to leave that in the activator for around about a minute, then give it another really good rinse, and then it goes into the UltraStrike solution. Okay, I'll take these next door, rinse them again. Now I'm just going to turn my power supply off just while I get these parts in, so there's no chance of shorting out to the anodes. So just make sure they're fully submerged. Okay, power on. And the power supply is showing 1 volt, even though I've got it set to 2, but it's drawing the full ½ amp now. I may just run the amperage up a little bit. I'm going to leave them in for around about probably 10 minutes or 15 minutes. If you leave it in longer than that, you get a thicker coating of copper, but it also starts to form a sort of a sludge on the surface. So we're just getting like a very, very thin coating of copper so that the nickel cobalt will actually work. If you want to fill defects in the surface of the steel, you really need to go from this UltraStrike solution to a normal copper plating solution, like an acid copper, and then buff it back. But I don't think I'm going to go that far with it. That's been about 1 minute, and you can see the copper on that already. Now the other one doesn't look as pretty as that. In fact, it looks awful. It's sort of blotchy, and that's because there's still chrome on that part. But it'll look different when we clean it back with some polish. Just while those two parts are plating, I've put this other hubcap back on the lathe, and I polished it up just with some metal polish and a cloth. The downside was I had to take the wire off the back of it, but it's not perfect, and I knew that. It's sort of got little speckles in it, but it's better than what it was, and when we get the nickel cobalt on that, I can polish it again. Now these two parts, I'll show you the bumper bar, and it's pretty ordinary really. All that blotchiness that you can see there is chrome that's still on the part, but I think I can polish that out. So we'll just do these parts one at a time or a couple at a time. At the end of the day, you just got to take what you can get with this. Okay, quick update. I'm just doing the last of the parts now, and these are the long, straight, skinny trims that were on that blue Fairlane. And here's one of the windscreen frames that's been done. Now I'm starting to have second thoughts about this. If you look really carefully, you see there's some little speckles of chrome still there, and the copper just didn't go over that. So if I try to do these in the nickel cobalt, it may leave little breaks in the finish, and that may cause corrosion later on. So the other option here is to zinc plate this. Now if I do it in zinc, it's a bit more forgiving. It tends to go over most metal substrates fairly easily, and it builds up thicker, and it's still going to come out shiny, but not like chrome. But I guess what I need to do is to do one of these parts in the zinc and then make a decision. So stand by. Just about to pack up for the day, but I thought I'd share this with you. What happened was I took this heater out of the plating bath and I rinsed it in a bucket of water and put it down on the bench while I went and cleaned the anodes. I was only gone about 2 minutes, and I came back and heard a sort of a sizzling sound and looked to see that this quartz heating element was bright red. It's completely melted the plastic housing, and of course what happens is this sensor isn't in the liquid with the heater, so it doesn't know that this is overheating and it doesn't switch it off. And this is why these things are very hard to buy now, because they start a lot of fires. Now if I'd put this down on a wooden bench and walked away and hadn't noticed, it would have set fire to the bench. And I think it still works, but it's going to need a new plastic cover. So another job for me to do. Oh well, never mind. Okay, it's time for an update now. I've totally chickened out here and I'm going to zinc plate these parts. So I've got one of the hubcaps sort of cleaned up. I'll put it in and I'll show you what it looks like. Now, it's not ideal. Zinc is a little bit more forgiving than the nickel cobalt, and it is covering these parts even though they've got some chrome showing through and some bare steel and some copper. So that's what I've decided to go with, and it's going to be shiny, but it won't be perfect. And the good news is I fixed my heater. I 3D printed a new cover for it and I've removed the mangled parts and stuck it on, and it is working. I'll show you that later. But I'll put this hubcap in now and then we'll have a look at it in about 5 minutes, see how it's going. Well, that's it after about 5 minutes. It needs to be rinsed off and it needs to be just given a light polish. But I think that's going to be okay. It's not as good as the nickel cobalt, but at least it's covering the metal and I can polish it better than that. So I'm just going to cycle all the parts through. There's a lot to do and they're all a bit different, so I won't bore you with watching the whole thing, but I'll show you when we're done and I think it's going to be okay. All of these parts have been processed now, so I thought I'd show you just a sample. Now, don't set your expectations too high when you're doing this. I knew that there were going to be sort of patches where there was corrosion, and now we've got zinc over the top of that, and you can certainly see where the corrosion was. But this is shiny. It should be fairly corrosion resistant from this point onwards. And all of these window frames had the plastic either damaged or missing, so I'm going to have to cut new plastic to go in those frames. And all of the tabs will need to be bent back inside at various points as we go forward with this. But let me show you the heater that I fixed. Okay, so after a late night 3D printing job, I got this new cover made and I just cut off the two ends. Now here's the mangled burnt plastic that was there. So I cut that off, I've slipped this new sleeve over the top and bonded that on with some clear epoxy. And yes, it does work. So that saved me having to try to find a new one. They are very, very hard to buy now. But anyway, it does work. Now, without your permission, I went ahead and I've assembled as much of these cars as I can to this point. Now, the Fairlane here was a bit of a mission. All of these trim pieces were very difficult to fit. A lot of them were bent and getting them to go back in place was quite hard. But I think I've got a pretty good representation of what it should look like. The paint on the police car turned out okay. I did forget that this section behind the rear seat was going to be visible, and there was some black overspray on that. So I just painted that by hand with a brush and some like a bronzy coloured acrylic paint, and that matches pretty well with the front section here. Now, I still have to put the stickers on the police car, and I've got multiple stickers made, so if I mess some up I can get a replacement. And the other thing I need to do is to replace this plastic material that was in the frames around the windows, the front and rear windscreen I guess. So I need to find a replacement for that material. And then we can fit that to the steel frames and finish the cars off. Now I decided with the hubcaps to just leave them as they are. On the original model there was a white ring around the outside, like a white wall representation. But I've decided not to do that. I think the hubcaps look pretty good as they are. It makes it look really badass, like low profile tyres. So yeah, I'm going to leave that. And I'm going to ask you to come back and see these as finished units. Now I've run out of time today, but in the next episode we'll get the plastic in the window frames, we'll get the stickers on this car, we'll do the full reassembly, and I'll show you what they look like in the room where they're going to go on display. Now I want to leave you some wildlife clips, so we'll do that, and then I'll see you in the next episode. Presso signing out for now. Cheers. The female eastern grey kangaroos hanging around our place this morning, and she decided it's okay to eat our red fountain grass, which is cultivated and took ages to grow. But we just saw the joey for the first time. Just leave it alone. You got no chance. It's like 10 times bigger than you. You're just going to stalk at it.